Hello, my name's Tom Bartholomew. I am the director of the State Hospital Psych Rehab Initiative, which we call SHPRI. And that our work is part of a long-term academic affiliation between Rutgers University and the state psychiatric hospitals of New Jersey. And today I want to take about 9 minutes to tell you about a program called the Clinical Formulary of Recovery-Oriented Programs. This program is a project to establish, supervise, and evaluate a small set of psychosocial programs that form what we call a clinical formulary. And a clinical formulary is like a medication formulary, except that instead of identifying the medications that are available to treat a given condition, a clinical formulary establishes what programs are available to treat a particular condition. And so this program is identifying a small number of them, 8 to be precise. And the idea is by having a greater focus on these 8 programs, we're going to increase uniformity statewide, as well as the quality of these programs. So here's the current list of the clinical formulary programs. And this list will absolutely change over time as we find more evidence for given programs, or we find that maybe some of these programs don't work particularly well. So it's understood that these are not forever. This is not the forever list. The project has 2 goals. The first goal is to support staff that are providing these programs. And the second goal is to improve the clinical outcomes of these programs, of these 8 programs. Each of these 2 goals, supporting staff and improving the clinical outcomes, will be assessed for both fidelity and for outcomes. So what does this mean? So fidelity can be thought of as a check on whether an intervention was delivered as intended. So if you think of the term fidelity, it means a good copy. So a high fidelity stereo system is making a good copy, producing a good copy of the original music, for example. And you can think of an example of fidelity is, imagine people were taking medication to lower their blood pressure. And some of the folks in the study on this miss 5, 6, 10 doses in a row. And then they complain that the medication is not helping them reduce their blood pressure. Well, this is an example of a failure of fidelity. So the intervention, taking a pill, say daily, was not done as intended. And if we don't know that occurred, we might increase the person's medication and really harm them in that case. Because if they ever did start taking the medication more regularly, could make them ill. So this is an example on needing to check whether an intervention was delivered as intended to know whether the intervention really doesn't work or it was really a failure of doing it the way it was intended, the way it was designed. The second part of this, the measurement of outcomes. So you can think of an outcome as different than an output. So an output is, say, that we are providing 10 groups on social skills. We have 10 social skills groups. But that doesn't tell you if the social skills groups have fidelity. So are they being delivered as intended? Or maybe we're just watching YouTube videos in those groups, and there's really nothing to do with social skills. It also doesn't tell you whether the groups are helping people improve their social skills. And by doing that, are they having better relationships? Do they have more friends? Do they have more intimate partners? That kind of thing. So that would be an outcome, which is what is the effect of an intervention on an important variable? So let's look at the first goal, the supporting staff goal. There's 2 levels of this in the clinical formulary project. The first level is called intervention-specific clinical supervision. And it just means supervision of the 8 practices. So each of the 8 practices will have supervision provided. We call that intervention-specific clinical supervision. The second level focused on staff support is called meta-clinical supervision. And this refers to supervision for supervisors. And so any person supervising any of the 8 programs would attend this level of supervision. So let's break them down just a little more. The intervention-specific clinical supervision, this is for any of the staff providing the 8 formulary programs. And each program, so social skills would have a supervision and illness management or recovery would have a supervision. And they would meet 1 to 2 times a month with their hospital supervisor of that program. And they would use a generic agenda focused on 3 important elements of clinical supervision. And those 3 elements are restorative, meaning support, feeling restored, feeling validated, and being able to talk about your work in important ways. Formative means forming new skills, learning new things, learning to do the program better and better and better. And 3, a normative function, which is maintaining the norms of practice. So, ethical norms, but also the norms about evidence-based practices, following fidelity and things of that nature. And this agenda can be found at this link. And I'll show you a link to get to all of these at the end. It's the portal for this program. So here's the second level of support called meta-clinical supervision. And this is for the supervisors of the 8 programs. And they all meet together 1 time a month. And they use a generic agenda as well, but their agenda focuses on best practices in clinical supervision, because of course they're all supervising different programs. The focus is understandably different. And here's the link to that generic agenda. So as I mentioned, each of the 2 goals will be assessed for fidelity and outcomes. So the supporting staff goal, we want to look at whether the supervision was provided as intended. Was the supervision for each of these 8 programs restorative? Did we focus on supporting staff and building teams, things of that nature? And we're going to measure that using a survey of people in those supervisions. And here's a link to that survey. In terms of outcomes, we want to know if staff attended the clinical supervision, the intervention-specific clinical supervision, what were the outcomes of that? And if that supervision focused on staff support, did staff feel supported? And we're going to look at burnout and organizational commitment as measured by a survey. And here's a link to that survey. So these 2 links and the surveys associated with those links are for people attending intervention-specific clinical supervision. This first link at the top is done monthly, and the link at the bottom is done quarterly. So this, as I mentioned, the 2 goals, this is the second goal, to improve clinical outcomes. And here again, you see the same 2, the focus on the same 2 things, fidelity and outcomes. And so we're going to look at the fidelity of the programs. Were they delivered as intended through what's called audit and feedback? So people providing these programs will either do a self-assessment, or they'll have a peer assess their group, or a supervisor assess their group, or their group could be audio or videotaped, and an assessment can be done on that tape. And here, this link is would allow you to get to all of the fidelity scales for the 8 programs. In terms of outcomes, in terms of looking at the outcomes of the clinical programs, these are measured by specific approaches for each of the programs. Because they're so different, you can't use the same outcome. They're not intended to do the same thing necessarily. And so here is a link to an outcome plan for each of the clinical programs. So The last thing I'll focus on is the implementation of this clinical formulary project. And it will be supported by staff from the Division of Behavioral Health Services, which is composed of 4 hospitals and the staff at the Department of Health that support those 4 hospitals. And that, of course, is Ann Klein, Ancora, Trenton, and Greystone psychiatric hospitals. But also, there'll be faculty from Rutgers University available. So there's a faculty person for each of the programs, and they can help with any kind of technical support, including trainings, supporting the supervisions to get started, supporting the fidelity assessments, that kind of thing. Secondly, we're going to use, we have been using implementation mapping meetings with stakeholders. So that means people providing the programs, their supervisors, and hospital administrators. And those meetings are to identify barriers to pulling this off, to doing this project, as well as solutions to those barriers. And so that we as a group can make this program a success. Now, of course, this program has to do with standardization across 4 very different institutions. And so there's a lot of important adaptations and work to be done. And it always feels like a bit of loss of control when you're asked to do something like everyone else. So it is a big change. And there needs to be a lot of support as we go forward. So anyway, lastly, we're going to proceed at the readiness of each of the sites. So as I mentioned, sites are very different. Some sites are already doing some of these programs, and that's fine. And so the goal is simply to move forward over the next 2 or 3 years and move to a place where we can provide the same programs in a high fidelity way and achieve reliably good outcomes is the goal. And as I mentioned, here's the master link for this project. And if I can, I'm going to bring up the, here's what the portal looks like when you go to that link. And as you see, this is this first report is a standardized hospital report. So this is where administrators would go and just enter how many of the programs are happening and how many of the programs are receiving supervision. Here's the supervision agendas that I mentioned, those generic agendas. This one's for intervention-specific supervision, and this one's for meta-supervision. And here you see the clinical supervision fidelity that I mentioned, and the clinical supervision outcomes are right here. Here are all the clinical program fidelity scales for the 8 programs. And here are the clinical program outcomes at this link here. If you scroll further down, you'll find program materials for the 8 programs. And coming soon, Smart Recovery and the Social Skills Manual, which is in development. And then there's some additional materials available for you. You can download these. Here is an implementation manual of the project, which has everything I said today, but also a good deal more information, as well as a list of faculty members that can support you in your efforts to implement this program. And then lastly, here's an elevator speech. It's just a 1-page document about this program. If you want to share some of the details quickly, you can download that and you're free to send that to whoever you think would benefit from it. All right, thank you so much. That concludes the presentation on the clinical formulary of recovery-oriented programs.